Hey friends, this is Jason Flatt, the host of Holy Star Wars. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that Holy Star Wars is looking for a co-host for the show as well as a producer. If you or anybody you know is interested and has experience in the realm of Star Wars, analytical reading, and/or audio production, send us your credentials and a short explanation of why you're interested in either position to holystarwars@gmail.com. Having somebody to bounce ideas off of and banter with on the show will go a long way to increasing both the quality and the quantity of Holy Star Wars. Again, that's holystarwars@gmail.com. Hi, hello, and welcome, my Force-sensitive friends, to Holy Star Wars. I'm Jason Flatt, and we are super excited to have made it to our second full episode of the show. Sometime just before Christmas, I saw Disney's latest animated classic, Moana. An all-star cast and crew were involved in making this story, and after thoroughly enjoying it in the theater, I came home to do some research on it, as I do with pretty much every movie I see right after I see it. With this one in particular, I was really curious what myth the film was based off of, as Disney animated classics are often retellings of stories from around the world. This time around, I was surprised to learn that the story of Moana was largely just made up for the film. Let me explain that a little more. What they did with her character, making sure that she was the true and obvious hero of the story and not clearly the more powerful male character, was fantastic. And the way they were intentional about having native voices and voice actors involved in the production to make it as authentic as possible was spot on. That said, Moana is a story based on an amalgamation of Polynesian myths and legends developed specifically for this film. Polynesia and the Polynesian peoples is a grouping of islands and cultures across the South Pacific, ranging from New Zealand to Hawaii, that have a shared language group, culture, and history. Spanning centuries, these people have migrated throughout the region and, as such, share many of the same stories. The story of Moana serves as a potential explanation for a real historical period in Polynesia known as the Long Pause, where voyaging and the spread of the peoples stopped for about 1,000 years. Throughout the film, many of the components from the second main character, Maui, to the adorable coconut armor-clad Kakamora, were based on Polynesian myths and legends, but the characterizations were entirely created for Moana. In fact, the entire plot was basically made up by the creators of the film. The titular character herself even was entirely made up for this movie. Moana means ocean, and in spite of the board of Polynesian individuals that oversaw the cultural accuracy of the creation of the movie, a lot of controversy has arisen over the essential writing of Polynesian myth and history by Disney for the world to be blissfully unaware of the true culture of Polynesia. Again, I think Moana is great and we should absolutely applaud it and see it. I just think that it raises a lot of interesting questions that we're going to discuss throughout the rest of this episode. With this film and the story surrounding it on my mind since seeing it, and knowing I wanted to do this second episode on the theme of humility, I could think of no better myth to explore this week than one that is truly from Polynesian mythology. Throughout this week's discussion, as well as all the discussions I'll ever have on this show, I want to practice humility in accepting that, enjoy Moana as I have and as we are permitted to, and appropriated Polynesian culture to a degree. I want to practice humility by being conscious of the fact that most of the myths, legends, and holy scriptures discussed on this show are not my own, and by working to never add or take away from the stories myself and stick as best as I can to exploring the depth of what is truly there. I guess at the bottom of it, what I'm really saying is that I want to be able to enjoy the cultures of other peoples and even definitely bring my own perspectives to them. I just want to make certain that our analyses don't cross any lines. And I'm not saying that Moana definitely does cross any line. That's all up to us to interpret ourselves. But the film definitely started a great conversation, I think. It's largely about listening, and listening is what being a great ally to other groups of peoples besides your own is all about. By the time of The Empire Strikes Back, our film for this week, Chewbacca is one of just a few of his kind left, the Wookiees, not held as a slave to the Galactic Empire. A weight like this could excuse any mortal creature from living a solitary, distressed life. Chewie, though, takes a page from last week's lesson in hope. He chooses to remain positive in the face of countless reasons not to. This humble creature, instead of pitying himself, binds himself to those others in his life and maintains an unwavering commitment to them. This commitment goes beyond just to his oldest friend Han Solo, who recent literature explains he feels he owes more than just friendship to, but to Luke, Leia, and even C-3PO. That's a particularly tender scene, and really the entire limb-losing debacle on Cloud City beautifully illustrate. When Han goes out into the frigid night on Hoth to search for a missing Luke, there's a particular moment that expresses perhaps the most powerful instance of humility in the entire film. Upon closing the shield doors to the rebel base, completely locking his two dear friends out in the frozen wilderness for the duration of the night, Chewbacca lets his head fall in a deep, expressive sorrow and anxiety. Chewbacca humbles himself to his emotions and allows them not only to be felt, but to be shared with those around him. One of the great essences of humility is opening yourself to others and allowing them to know your emotions. There's no expectation for others to understand, reciprocate, or even necessarily acknowledge your emotion. Humility merely requires that we express them. Showing your emotions can leave you vulnerable in a way that may at first seem like a discomfort, but more importantly, it will leave you relieved and allow you to be more aware of your emotional state. This exercise is not restricted to negative feelings either. Showing your excitement may be just as challenging as sorrow in some instances. To live more freely, we all need the humility to show how we're feeling at any given moment. The Maori people are the native people of New Zealand, a culture I'm not honestly especially familiar with, but I was really excited to learn more about while I made this episode. They pronounce the name something more like Maori, but even still, I'm probably saying it wrong, and the common way of pronouncing it in the United States is simply Maori, and it's how I will probably pronounce it throughout this episode, just to make sure that I'm not sounding ridiculous every time I attempt to say it, as much as I understand that it's not truly the pronunciation. While looking for just the right myth to go along with this episode, I stumbled upon Rona and the Moon. The story goes like this. Rona and her husband fought a lot. Like, a lot. And on one particular night, they were fighting about whose turn it was to fill up the taha, the water containers. In a fit of anger, Rona stormed out of the house. All the while, Marama, the moon, was watching Rona. While still carrying on upset, a large cloud passed in front of the moon, making it suddenly dark and causing Rona to trip over a tree's root. Injuring herself, Rona begins to curse Marama, blaming him for her having fallen. Marama warns Rona not to continue on cursing him or suffer consequences, but Rona pays no credence. She continues on insulting the moon, as Rona believes, for having caused her to trip. Marama decides that he has had enough of Rona's insolence and reaches down from the sky, grabs Rona, and pulls her up into the sky. Some time goes on, and Rona's husband finally comes to his senses and realizes he misses his wife and that he wronged her. All the while, Rona has begun to fall in love with Marama, the moon. Unlike her husband, Marama treats Rona with kindness and respect. One day, Marama gives Rona the choice whether to stay with him or to return to Earth to be with her husband. So in love with Marama, Rona decides to stay with the moon. As a gift to her, Marama granted Rona a special korowai, a cloak that grants her control over the ocean's tides. Rona becomes Rona Pakumautai, Rona, fastener of the sea. This myth serves to explain in Maori mythology the origin of the turning tides of the ocean. There are so many things I love about this story, and I think the most chief among those is another aspect of humility it illustrates. Just as well as humility is about healthy relationships with our emotions, humility is also about having a willingness to accept you are wrong, or a willingness to have changed your mind. Rhoda did not exhibit humility when she tripped over the tree root and blamed the moon. She chose to blame somebody else for her carelessness that she could have prevented had she been more careful. I understand entirely that she was in a terrible state and that perhaps the moon did play a particular role in her injury, but true humility would look past all this to recognize that the ultimate fault was her own, no matter what state she was in when it happened. That forgiving the moon for passing behind a cloud would be the humble thing to do, and that arousing unwarranted conflict, especially after having been pleaded with not to, is the exact opposite of humility. To me, humility is the ability to reconcile our flaws by trusting and loving ourselves nonetheless. Humility ultimately is about accepting things, whether that means accepting one's emotions, accepting one's place in the world, or accepting one's own faults. It's all about accepting and admitting great internal challenges and then following through with the proper external exhibition of them. I think another important discussion from the film of humility comes from Luke's trip to Dagobah. In one of the most classic scenes in The Empire Strikes Back, Luke argues with Yoda about how impossible it would be for anybody to remove his crashed X-Wing from the swamp. Having walked away in frustration, Luke is startled by what he either hears or feels coming from Yoda's direction. Yoda lifts the X-Wing with ease from the swamp using the Force, and the look on Luke's face says it all. I don't believe it are the only words he speaks, but it's clear to me at least that this was an admittance of having been wrong. Wrong about Yoda, wrong about the Force, and most especially, wrong about his own capabilities. It is deeply implied from his expression that the very next words Luke probably spoke would have been, "Please teach me." While on the topic of the Force, I want to get into a bit of a discussion about how humility is really integral to the understanding of the Force. Conversations about the nature of the Force are ones I want to try to have often, especially as the themes we discuss have serious relevance like this one does. Our understanding of the Force has evolved dramatically over time as more Star Wars material has been released. From a cool bit of space magic to a complex philosophy to a seemingly unifying pseudo or maybe even full on religious factor, for every question answered by new canon material, 10 more questions are asked. Star Wars fans everywhere have vastly different understandings of the Force. Some stick to the original understanding that there is a light side and a dark side, light being good, dark being bad, and that the light side should always prevail over the dark. While that particular dichotomy is a fantastic discussion for another time, it is important for me to say that I will definitely be taking a more nuanced approach to attempting to understand the Force. The Force is a mysterious power that we still learn about more all the time. One thing for certain is that for Force sensitive beings, those either in control of or especially attuned to the Force, their emotions are deeply connected to either the Force itself or their ability to connect with it, or both. It is said that the dark side of the Force, which we are led to believe is inherently evil, is fueled by negative emotions, and all the opposites are for the light side. In Christie Golden's canon book, Dark Disciple, Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi is described on page 23 as adept at concealing his emotions in the Force. Myriad interpretations could follow this line, but the one I prescribe to is that a Jedi, or a user of the light side of the Force, is not designed to be an emotionless being, as many of the Jedi we know, particularly during the prequel era, would have us believe. Rather, Jedi do in fact feel deeply and have become adept at using the Force to mask those emotions so others can't sense them. Personally, I would argue that one of the greatest causes of the downfall of the Jedi Order was that the Jedi had lost their emotional humility. One of the most obvious differences shown between the dark and light sides of the Force is that the dark side is powered by emotion, whereas the light side is powered by compassion. What I mean when I say that they lost their emotional humility is I believe that what happened to the Jedi is that they became so adept at concealing their emotions that they really just forgot what having those emotions might actually be like. They were so used to just bottling them up that they never really expressed them, which I understand entirely for the sake of their order and their purpose makes a lot of sense. But because they were so unable to express and understand emotion when other people, other beings across the galaxy expressed them, they weren't really able to relate. And if you can't relate, you can't have that level of emotional humility, then you can't be compassionate because compassion is all about being able to relate to other people's emotions and react based on that. When Darth Vader asks Luke, "Search your feelings, you know it to be true," in response to Luke's denial that Vader was his father, I think the Sith Lord was testing Luke's humility. Star Wars has over the years shown us that emotions and the Force has strong relation to one another, and one of those ways is seemingly the Force's ability to influence emotion just as much as emotion influences usage of the Force. We see a lot of evidence, especially of this during Episode 3. So when Darth Vader asks Luke to search his feelings, he implies to do so through the Force to confirm the ugly truth. On a deeper level, though, I think Vader is asking Luke to have the humility to accept what he has been told is true and to accept what he is feeling is real and valid. Yet, Luke had to be careful, too. He knew Vader had the ulterior motive of making Luke give in to anger and hatred, fuels for the dark side, and searching his feelings could lead Luke to just that. Vader did want him to join him after all in becoming the Sith and ruling the galaxy. This is what leads me to another and possibly the most encompassing definition of humility. Another of the many ways to explain humility is that it is finding the balance between how small we are and how big we are at the same time. We're both a small cog in the greater machine that could well function just fine without us, but we put in the work because every piece does matter. And we're at the same time great and empowered and important to the very fabric of the world around us, but we need to make sure we're doing so without overpowering those we are supporting. Sometimes being humble is about being something small and being proud of who we are regardless, and sometimes it's about being humble as something big and never letting that overshadow others. Humility is finding it within ourselves to live as though both are true at the same time, because they are. The trouble with the black and white split the Jedi teach exists between the light side and the dark side as it pertains to emotion is this. On one hand, when we act emotionally, we often forget the emotions of others, losing the compassion that gives us a greater sense of our place in the world and diminishing our humility. On the other hand, if we conceal our emotions too heavily, we also lose the ability to be compassionate because we no longer have a point of reference to understand how others are feeling. To me, humility teaches us a lesson about the Force and that true balance may lie somewhere in between, somewhere where we are able to conceal and express our emotions as appropriate, so that we can be like Luke and be both free of our self-carried prisons and be strong enough not to be overcome by arrogance. So we can have both a healthy relationship with our emotions to derive power from, as well as put ours aside when necessary to make space for others to feel and us to affirm their feelings. Tying it all back to Rona and the moon, the character I think who was in the most need of more humility was Rona's husband. He needed to realize that fighting over household chores is ridiculous, that he needed to play an equal part in his household chores, and maybe even that he, as the man, unfortunately had inherent power over Rona that he was responsible for negating. Basically, he needed to find the balance between being big and being small and humbly managed to accept both. Of course, as always, these are just some of the many examples of humility in the texts and interpretations of what all that means. And we would love to hear some of your opinions on the subject and other examples you found in episode 5 and in Rona and the Moon. You can share those thoughts with us by tweeting to @holy_star_wars, by emailing us at holystarwars@gmail.com, or visiting us online at holystarwars.weebly.com. That's Weebly spelled Weebly. Those are all also fantastic places to get all the most up-to-date info on the show, making a donation, contacting us, viewing blog versions of our episodes, check out our radio drama Trope Troopers, and get visuals of all the tropes we cover in the final segment of each episode. Speaking of tropes and trope troopers, remember that in addition to the show that comes out every Thursday, we also have a fantastic and interactive radio drama that comes out every Wednesday. Every episode of Trope Troopers works to take the last week's theme and weave mine and your stories about how we incorporated the trope and theme of the week into our own lives to make them more full. So the stories you sent us about last week's trope, the hero's journey, and theme hope, were used to influence the story in yesterday's episode of Trope Troopers. And then next Wednesday's Trope Troopers were influenced by today's trope, Anthropomorphic Personification, and theme, humility. Looking forward to hearing from all of you as always. I hope you enjoyed the first episode of Trope Troopers yesterday. For lots of behind-the-scenes info and cool extra tidbits about the show, how characters came to be, and some concept art even coming soon, be sure to check out our website and our Twitter account. This week's trope has a long and tongue-twisting name, Anthropomorphic Personification. Anthropomorphic personification is when we take large concepts such as happiness or sadness or death or the ocean or the moon even, and we make them into characters in a story. So think the Pixar film Inside Out basically, or even the moon in the story of Rona and the Moon. Personification is anytime we give human-like qualities or use human-specific phrasing to describe non-human things. And anthropomorphism is when we take inanimate objects or just non-human animals and make them act like humans. The term seems a bit redundant, but that's because something can be personification without being anthropomorphism, but something can't be anthropomorphism without being personification. So the powers that be who invented the term just wanted to sound sophisticated, probably. But it's important to remember. Regardless, after the challenging trope that we ended last week's episode with, I wanted to do a more simple one this week. If you have free hands while you're listening to this, grab a pencil and some paper, and I want you to draw or describe what you think anthropomorphic personification of humility looks like. I know that probably sounds tough, but I would recommend just carving out 5 minutes minimum to really sit down and think about it. Then, once you've drawn it out and described it, was what you came up with a big creature or a small one? For example, when I did this exercise for myself, I drew an ant carrying a pretty nice sized rock on its back. I drew something small because my immediate first thought when I think of humility is the small cog in a big machine part of it. Now, take whichever side of the spectrum your drawing landed on, small cog in a big machine, or large yet truly humble, and think about how your new made-up character also can be described with the other. So in my example, while the small ant at first to me represented the idea of a small ant proudly doing his part to support his colony, while thinking about it on the flip side, the ant I drew is so incredibly powerful, able to lift rocks numerous times his own height, and is so proud of how his particular skill of lifting the heaviest rocks helps make him especially helpful, even if the work could in truth be done without him there. Of course, my ant character never brags about his strength, he doesn't have hubris in the matter, but he knows for himself that he is this really important, strong part of the ant colony. I was able to take this same anthropomorphic personification of humility and have it rock both of the attitudes, no pun intended, of humility by accepting its downfalls and its position in the world and using them to its advantage. Do this fun and easy exercise, and as you go about your life throughout this next week, try to think about how you too are both large and small at the same time. Notice it in your own life, because it's true of all of us, and focus on the ways you can work to achieve the perfect balance of feeling and exhibiting both in your life. Feel free to share this experience with friends and family, and definitely write to us with your personal stories of working towards humility in your life, as well as sending us your drawings or descriptions even if you like. If we get any great drawings and you're willing, we might post them on our website or on Twitter. Don't forget, if you send us your personal stories, they might influence the plot or characters in Trope Troopers. I've loved investigating this theme of humility through Empire Strikes Back and the Maori myth Rona and the Moon. And I'm just as excited for next Thursday when we discuss Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, our first legend as opposed to a myth, Japanese legend of Momotaro, and the theme of teamwork. Special thanks to the Careers Office of the Government of New Zealand and maoridictionary.co.nz for the education on this week's myth, Rona and the Moon, and pronunciation of Maori words. I'm looking forward to your stories, Trope Troopers on Wednesday, and the next main show on Thursday. Thanks for listening.